Have you ever stopped to think that sometimes a single gesture can change the course of your life forever, and that the moment you decide to act, there's no turning back? That day, the sun scorched the skin, the dry air scratched the throat, and the horizon seemed to melt in the desert heat. But for him, the real weight didn't come from the weather. It came from what was approaching, a silent danger, invisible to those who didn't know what to look for, but palpable to any man used to living on the edge. Stay with me until the end, because what you're about to discover may surprise you. The cowboy walked with calculated steps, each creak of his boots sounding like a warning. He wasn't a man of many friends. He wasn't the kind to get into trouble, at least not anymore. But fate, that old acquaintance that loves to play tricks, seemed to have other plans. And that day, those plans came in the form of a young native, injured, covered in dust, and with eyes wide in fear. Have you ever been there? Finding someone on the brink of collapse, in desperate need of help, but knowing that lending a hand could cost you dearly. That's exactly how he felt. And as much as he was aware of the consequences, there was something in that gaze that wouldn't let him walk away. It was as if, in silence, the young man was screaming for help, and as if, in some deep corner of his soul, the cowboy had been hearing that scream all along. The wind blew strong, carrying with it a trail of dust and something more. Rushed footsteps, distant voices, signs that the chase was closing in. The cowboy knew how to read situations like this. When someone is being hunted, there's no time to think too much. You either act or you become an accomplice to the tragedy. That stretch of land was no place for the innocent, nor for innocence itself. And hiding a native, especially in times of tension and distrust, meant picking a fight with dangerous people, people who didn't forgive, people who would do anything to send a message to anyone daring to defy them. But there's something curious about men like him. The more life hardens them, the rarer the moments of compassion become, and when they happen, they're non-negotiable, no matter the cost, no matter the risk. And in that instant, the cowboy knew he was about to cross a line from which there would be no return. What he didn't know was that this seemingly simple gesture, just opening the barn door and signaling for the young man to hide, inside would be the beginning of a story that would change everything. A story of pursuit, loyalty, and an unlikely alliance, forged in silence and secrecy. As the sun slowly sank, painting the sky in fiery tones, the tension only grew stronger. He could feel, almost like an animal instinct, that he was being watched. The desert had eyes, and in the shadows, there were those ready to strike. Can you imagine what it's like to have your life in the hands of strangers, or to trust that, at the right moment, someone you barely know will risk everything for you? That was the reality of that day. A dangerous game where one wrong move could mean the end. And so, without knowing the size of the storm he was about to face, the cowboy made his choice. A choice that could not be undone. A path that, once taken, could only lead to two destinations, ruin or something far greater. But that is something you'll understand better in the next chapter of this story. He knew that from that moment on, every step would have to be calculated. The distant sound of hooves on dry ground seemed to draw closer, like a warning that time was running out. The young native breathed quickly, trying to control his panic, while the cowboy kept his eyes fixed on the barn door, alert to any movement. It was one of those moments when your whole life seems to compress into just a few seconds, and yet every detail is etched in memory forever. And that's exactly why I want to hear from you. If you were in his place, what would you do? Would you risk everything to protect someone you barely know? Or would you take the safer path, avoiding trouble? If this resonates with you, share in the comments what has touched you the most in this story so far. I read each one, and your words help create a space where we can reflect together on courage, empathy, and difficult choices. Your participation here is what helps this channel grow and reach more people with this kind of content. When you hit the like button, YouTube understands that this message is worth sharing. And when you subscribe, you make sure you'll be with me for the next stories. Stories that, like this one, have the power to stir the heart and change the way we see the world. So, if this story has already stirred something in you, hit like now and subscribe to keep following this journey, because what's coming next will still surprise you, and you'll want to be here when it happens. Meanwhile, outside, The wind kept blowing dust across the yard, carrying with it the distant scent of smoke and danger. The heat seemed to rise not only from the merciless sun, but from the very ground itself, as if the earth held decades of pent-up anger. The landscape was a sea of golden dust, broken here and there by twisted shrubs and old fences that no longer served their purpose. In the distance, the silhouettes of mountains cut across the sky, imposing and silent, like guardians of ancient secrets. The town, small and almost forgotten by time, was made of narrow streets, weathered wooden facades, and doors that creaked at the lightest touch of the wind. In the midst of it all lived the cowboy, a man of few words, the kind who carried more stories in his eyes than on his lips. His face, marked by deep wrinkles, was not just the product of age, but of the hard life he had chosen, or perhaps that had chosen for him. His hands, calloused and steady, told of years of hard work, of battles fought not only against the desert, but against himself. He was not the kind of figure anyone would point to as a hero. In fact, many there saw him as someone who had made his mistakes and paid a high price for them. He lived simply, a modest house on the edge of town, a horse that knew his steps by heart, and a small patch of land where he spent more time fixing than harvesting. The old hat, worn and faded, seemed to have weathered as many storms as he had, and maybe that's why, to those who looked closely, there was something more there, a kind of silent resilience, as if somewhere inside him there was still an untouched fragment, uncorrupted by the cynicism that had taken hold of so many. This was his routine, crossing the main street, greeting the few familiar faces with a slight nod, stepping into the general store to get only what he needed, avoiding long conversations. The town already had its stories about him, and he never bothered to correct a single one. He had learned that the hidden truth about us rarely matters to those who have already decided what to believe. But that day, something was different. Maybe it was the excessive quiet, or the way the dogs, usually lazy, were restless, or maybe it was just one of those hunches you can't explain, but life teaches you to respect. The fact was, there was a tension in the air, an almost invisible weight that followed his every step. As he crossed the street, the sun reflected off broken windows, casting beams of light that cut through the suspended dust. He noticed quick glances turning toward him, as if there was something others knew and he didn't yet. The feeling of being at the center of a story that hadn't yet begun was strange, and yet familiar. After all, his life had always been marked by decisions made without warning, by abrupt changes in course. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because what defined that man wasn't just the life he lived, but the mindset that kept him standing. It was as if he carried within himself his own compass, one that pointed toward what was right, even when right wasn't the safest choice. And in lands like those, the safest choices were the ones that kept you far from trouble, something he never seemed to do well. There was in him a strange mix of weariness and strength. The weariness came from battles lost, from mistakes that couldn't be erased. The strength came from the small victories only he knew he had won. And maybe that was exactly what made him different. It wasn't the shine of a perfect hero, but the weight of someone who had already seen rock bottom and still chose to keep riding. That was the foundation on which everything else was about to unfold. And to understand what was about to happen, you first had to understand who he was and why, despite everything, there was still room inside him for a gesture capable of changing destinies. Comment: this makes sense to me. It was then, in the middle of the monotony of yet another day, like so many others, that something broke the predictable rhythm of his routine. The cowboy had just left the general store, with a sack of grain slung over his shoulder, and his mind busy with small repairs he needed to make in the barn before sunset. But just a few yards from home, a detail caught his attention, something that didn't belong to the familiar landscape. In the corner where the wooden fence met the dry brush, there was a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible. It wasn't the wind. It was something, or someone. He approached cautiously, his step firm but silent, and his hand instinctively resting on the holster. On the ground, half covered by dust and dry leaves, a young native was hunched over, breathing heavily. His skin was marked by exhaustion, and his half-closed eyes carried a weariness that went beyond the physical. It was as if that body was fighting not to give in. There was dried blood on his lips, but no open wound in sight. Maybe the pain was deeper, the kind that doesn't show itself right away. The cowboy stood there watching, not exactly sure what to think. His first reaction was one of caution. In lands like those, finding a wounded native was never simple. It could be a genuine plea for help, or the start of an ambush. He knew the stories, the rumors that traveled through town, and he was well aware of the unspoken tension between his people and the region's tribes. But there was something in that face that made him hesitate. It wasn't ordinary fear. It was the look of someone who had already seen too much, and yet still refused to stop living. Now I want to dig even deeper into this, because in that moment, it wasn't just a meeting. It was the collision of two different journeys, two worlds that rarely crossed paths peacefully. And it's curious how certain decisions present themselves almost invisibly. A moment before, he was just a man heading home. A moment later, he was facing a choice that could change everything. There were no witnesses, no time for long internal debates. All that existed there was the raw need to act. The cowboy knew that if he turned his back, he would probably be protecting himself. He would avoid questions, sidelong glances, and any kind of retaliation. But he also knew that by doing so, he would carry the weight of having abandoned someone to their fate. And that was something he could never forget, no matter how hard he tried. Life had already taught him that some chances to show who you really are don't come twice. And often they're not beautiful or convenient. They're harsh, dangerous, and put everything you've built at risk. The young man lifted his head with effort, as if trying to say something, but no words came. The only sound that escaped was a faint murmur, almost swallowed by the wind. In that moment, the cowboy noticed marks on his wrists, as if he had been tied up. His heavy breathing revealed that the escape had been long and desperate. He knelt beside the boy, still, without touching him, studying him closely. He caught the scent of dust mixed with sweat, and beneath it, a distant trace of smoke, a sign that somewhere there had been a recent fire. His heartbeat quickened, not from immediate fear, but from realizing that the young man wasn't alone in this story. Where there are those being hunted, there are hunters. And if he had made it this far, it was because the chase was happening much closer than was safe. The cowboy's mind worked quickly, calculating routes, openings, and the time he might have before anyone noticed his presence there. He didn't know who was after the native, but he knew how to recognize the heavy silence that comes before trouble. And in that desert, trouble never came slowly. He stood there, feeling the invisible weight of that decision press against his chest. The dry wind blew, carrying grains of sand that stung his face like tiny needles. No one was around, and yet he felt as though he was being watched, as if the desert itself had eyes waiting to see what he would do. The young native remained on the ground, breathing hard, his gaze fixed on him, as if trying to read his soul. And in a way, he was. Helping meant stepping into dangerous territory. He knew that offering shelter would mean picking a fight with people who didn't forgive, people who saw any act of compassion as an insult. And that wasn't all. In a small town, news doesn't travel. It flies. All it would take was one person seeing him lead the young man onto his property for rumors, accusations, and judgments to spread. He had carried the weight of suspicion before, and he knew how much it could corrode a life. On the other hand, turning away would be easier, and much harder at the same time. Easier, because all he'd have to do was keep walking and let the desert take care of what was left of that young man. Harder, because his face would be burned into memory, returning on silent nights to remind him that he could have done something and didn't. There was a kind of mark you couldn't see, but that burned from the inside, and the cowboy knew that scar well. He had made mistakes before, but he wasn't willing to repeat one he knew would haunt him. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this dilemma wasn't just about the moment. It was about the mindset we carry throughout the journey. The decisions we make when no one is watching are the ones that truly shape who we are. And he knew that, regardless of the consequences, certain choices define not only the present, but also who we become from that point forward. There's a hidden truth in these moments of silence. The price of omission is often higher than the price of courage. The cowboy thought about the backstage of his own story. He remembered how years ago he'd made the wrong choice to save his own skin, and how that had sent him into a spiral of regret and mistrust. He also remembered the rare times he had taken risks to help someone, and how even when the outcome wasn't perfect, there was something transformative about the feeling of having done the right thing. The difference lay in the impact it left inside him, a weight or a peace. He looked again at the young man. He didn't know his name or where he came from, but he could feel the urgency radiating from him. This wasn't just an escape. It was a desperate attempt to survive something that was only a few steps away from catching him. And if there was one thing common to everyone who had ever faced a hunt, it was that behind the physical exhaustion, there burned a stubborn flame that refused to go out. Deep down, the cowboy already knew what his choice would be, not out of impulse, but because his own story didn't allow him to do otherwise. It was almost as if every scar, every mistake, and every past victory were there, whispering the answer. And though the fear of retaliation was real, he understood that true transformation doesn't happen when you take the safe path, but when you face the risk head-on. He took a deep breath, feeling the dry air scratch his throat. One step forward and his life could change. One step back and nothing would change, at least not on the outside. But inside, he knew something would break. And the worst prison isn't the one the world imposes, but the one we build with our own choices. The silence that followed felt heavier than any scream. The cowboy stood motionless for a few seconds, as if every muscle needed his mind's permission to move. Then, without saying a word, he crouched and extended his hand to the young native. The boy hesitated, but weakness overcame distrust. That handshake wasn't just to help him up. It was a silent pact, sealed right there, between two men who knew that from that moment on, nothing would ever be the same. He slid his arm beneath the young man's shoulder and lifted him firmly, feeling the weight not only of the exhausted body, but of the entire situation. A quick glance around confirmed what he already feared. There wasn't much time. The wind carried distant, muffled sounds, but ones impossible to mistake. Hurried footsteps, perhaps hooves in the distance. Whatever it was coming. Without thinking twice, he headed for the barn. Each step kicked up small clouds of dust, and every creak of the gate seemed far too loud. He pushed open the wooden door, which gave way with a groan, revealing a dark interior, heavy with the smell of hay and oil. He led the young man to a corner where stacks of sacks and an old rusted wagon created a narrow space. There he improvised a hiding spot, dragged the sacks over, shifted the wagon, and covered it with a thick tarp that looked like it hadn't been moved in years. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this wasn't just a physical action, but a strategic decision shaped by the mindset of someone who had lived long enough to understand that, in certain situations, haste must walk hand in hand with precision. This wasn't impulsive heroism. It was a quick calculation of risks, opportunities, and above all, what he was willing to lose. Behind this choice were memories that flashed through his mind. Moments when he had hesitated and lost, times when he had trusted too much and paid dearly. Those invisible scars, more than any moral principle, guided his movements. He knew that for the plan to work, every detail had to be believable. A poorly made hiding place would draw attention. A hesitant gesture would betray guilt. That's why the execution was almost instinctive. Cover, disguise, create silence. As he adjusted the tarp, he felt the young man shrink inward, as if trying to disappear. No words were exchanged, but a brief meeting of eyes revealed something, a mix of fear and relief. It was as if the native understood that, even without promises, this man had just risked more than he realized. The cowboy took a deep breath, closed the barn door, and walked out, forcing his steps to remain slow, like a man with nothing to hide. He knew that if anyone saw him nervous, everything would collapse. The art of surviving in places like this wasn't just about strength or a steady aim. It was about keeping the truth buried under a convincing layer of normalcy. He positioned himself by the fence, pretending to watch the horizon, but every sense was heightened. The heat felt heavier, the air denser. The sounds from the desert were clearer now, carrying the promise that something, man or someone, was about to arrive. And in that brief pause, he understood there was no turning back. The choice had been made, and with it, the fates of both men had become entwined. The sound of footsteps came first. Muffled by the dust, the wind kicked up along the main street. Then came the creak of saddles, the jingle of spurs, and the dull thud of hooves against dry ground. The cowboy didn't need to turn his head to know these weren't ordinary visitors. There was a weight in the way they moved, as if each step was calculated to impose presence. He stayed leaning against the fence, eyes fixed on the horizon as though simply watching the weather, but inside, every muscle was ready to react. When the riders entered the town, silence spread like a shadow. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, doors shut, and the few who remained in sight quickly averted their eyes. 3 men, mounted on dark horses, rode down the street with the unsettling calm of those who know they are feared. The leader, a tall man with sun-hardened skin and a thick mustache, gripped the reins firmly and swept the place with a cold, calculating gaze. They stopped in front of the general store. One of them dismounted, tied his horse to the post, and went inside, leaving the door open behind him. The other 2 stayed outside, scanning the landscape as if every corner could be hiding something. The cowboy held his posture, but his mind worked fast. It was impossible not to feel the weight of the tension. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because these moments are the ultimate mindset test. It's when the hidden truth has to remain locked away, and any flicker of nervousness can become the key to uncovering it. Keeping the body relaxed and the face neutral wasn't just about self-control, it was pure survival. Behind the scenes, every second counted. The controlled breathing, the slow rhythm of movement, everything had to project normalcy, even if his heart was pounding like a hammer. The man in the general store came out a few minutes later, chewing something and wearing a suspicious expression. The 3 gathered in the middle of the street and began talking in low voices, but the wind carried fragments of words, just enough for the cowboy to understand they were looking for someone. He didn't hear a name, but from the way they described him, it was clear they were talking about the young man now hidden under the tarp at the back of his barn. One of the riders looked directly at him. It wasn't a quick glance, it lingered as if measuring every reaction, every micro-expression. The cowboy returned it with an almost imperceptible nod, the kind given to a stranger out of courtesy and nothing more. Inside, he was calculating the odds that they might decide to search nearby properties. The leader pulled on the reins and moved his horse forward a few steps, closing the distance. The air seemed to grow heavier. The cowboy knew that if questioned, he would have to give answers that were simple, direct, and left no room for suspicion. Improvisation would be inevitable, but it only works when it's backed by calm. The man then asked if he had seen anyone pass through here in the last few hours. The question was dry, direct, without embellishment. The cowboy held his gaze, shrugged, and replied that no, around here, only dust and wind passed by. He said it with a steady voice, unhurried, and most importantly, without trying too hard to sound convincing. Because overacting is what betrays a lie. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. The leader stared at him for a few more seconds, as if searching for the slightest sign of hesitation, then pulled on the reins again, turning his horse. The 3 of them rode down the street, slowly disappearing into the dust they kicked up. The cowboy, however, knew that didn't mean the danger had passed. When the dust stirred by the riders finally settled and the sound of hooves faded into the horizon, the cowboy let out a long breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He walked back to the barn with steady steps, though inside he still felt the weight of the tension clinging to him. Opening the door, he found the young native curled up, eyes sharp, like those of an animal unsure if it can trust. The cowboy crouched down, pulled the tarp back carefully, and offered a canteen of water. The boy took it with both hands, as if it were a treasure. No words were spoken in that moment, but the gesture said enough. There was gratitude in his gaze, silent, deep, needing no explanation. The cowboy noticed that even in weakness, the native carried himself with dignity, his back as straight as possible, as if his identity could not be bent by exhaustion. That caught his attention. It was unlike anything he had seen before. In the days that followed, recovery was slow. The cowboy found food, tended to his wounds, and the young man gradually began to give back in small ways, helping clean the barn, chopping firewood, organizing tools. It wasn't just about physical survival, but an exchange of respect. In the silence they shared, something new was taking root. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this kind of bond isn't built only through favors or kind words. It's woven into routine, into the details, into the mutual understanding that each is, in some way, entrusting their life to the other. It's a kind of unwritten pact, where gestures replace promises, and looks carry more weight than any contract. There was one night, for example, when the cowboy returned late after checking on the cattle and found a small fire lit in the yard. The native was there, singing something in a language he didn't understand. The melody was soft, almost a whisper, and carried a tone that blended sorrow and reverence. Without saying a word, the cowboy sat nearby, and they stayed there, staring into the embers, each lost in their own memories. They didn't need to speak to know that moment would be remembered. One day, the young man pulled from inside his clothing a small talisman carved from wood. He offered it to the cowboy, holding it with both hands. The man hesitated, not out of unwillingness to accept, but because he felt the symbolic weight of it. It was more than a gift, it was a sign of trust and acknowledgement. He accepted it, tucking it into the inside pocket of his vest, a place where he carried only a few things, all of them important. Over time, they began sharing stories. The cowboy spoke of sandstorms, skittish horses, and deals gone wrong. The native, in short phrases and gestures, told of hunts, distant rivers, and life in the mountains. What had seemed like a cultural abyss became an invisible bridge. Each story revealed not only different customs, but universal emotions: loss, courage, hope. That quiet companionship began changing the cowboy from the inside out. He started noticing that a transformation was taking place, a shift in the way he looked at the world. The hard lines of his face seemed to soften when he saw the native smiling discreetly after completing a simple task. It was as if, in the midst of constant tension, they had found small islands of peace. Still, the danger had not disappeared. They both knew it. At any moment, the shadows of the hunt could return, and perhaps it was precisely that awareness that made each moment more intense, as if they were living behind the scenes of a story that would sooner or later demand its price. Time passed, and the native could move more steadily, though his body still bore the marks of a long, exhausting escape. The cowboy, who at first had seen his presence as a dangerous burden, began to notice something different about the young man, something beyond the quiet strength or the dignity he maintained, even in his most fragile moments. It was as if there was a hidden meaning, a far greater story behind those watchful eyes. The revelation came one afternoon when the sky was heavy, promising rare rain for those dry lands. An older man, imposing in appearance yet carrying himself with calm authority, appeared at the edge of the property. He was unarmed, but his gaze held the firmness of someone who bore great authority. He introduced himself simply, speaking a name the cowboy recognized instantly. He was the leader of one of the most respected and feared tribes in the region. The meeting was brief, but intense. The old man didn't need many words to make it clear that he knew exactly who was hiding there. And in that moment, the cowboy learned the truth. The young man he had rescued, fed, and protected at the risk of his own life was the only son of the tribal leader. He wasn't just a fugitive, he was an heir, someone whose existence carried political and cultural weight for the entire people he represented. Now, I want to go even deeper into this, because that revelation didn't just change the way the cowboy saw the young man, it also changed the meaning of every decision he had made up to that point. Hiding him, which was already dangerous, now carried far greater implications. It was no longer just about protecting a single life, but about safeguarding a central piece in a complex web of alliances, rivalries, and ancient memories between communities. Behind this realization, the cowboy also understood something else. That silent trust that had formed between them wasn't a coincidence. The young man knew that by accepting the help of an outsider, he was breaking protocol and taking a risk in the name of something bigger. And in a way, that breaking of barriers reflected the very transformation both of them were undergoing. The tribal leader didn't express his gratitude effusively. His expression was controlled, but there was respect in his tone. He simply said that he would remember what the cowboy had done. Those words, short, almost cryptic, carried a weight the cowboy felt echo inside him. It wasn't an ordinary promise. It was a silent commitment, a record etched into the memory of someone who had the power to change destinies. After the leader left, carrying with him an unspoken message, the cowboy stood alone for a few minutes, staring at the horizon. He was trying to process the impact of it all. It wasn't just about the risk he had taken, but about what that gesture now meant in the larger picture. in those lands where alliances and rivalries could last for entire generations. The native, now steadier on his feet, kept helping with the ranch chores, but there was a different light in his eyes. The cowboy understood that with this revelation, their relationship had gained new layers. They were no longer just two men brought together by a dangerous twist of fate. Now they were bound by an invisible thread that crossed territories, histories, and responsibilities far greater than themselves. The years passed like the desert wind, sometimes soft, almost imperceptible, and other times so strong they tore everything in their path. The cowboy went on with his life, keeping the same simple routine, mending fences, tending cattle, and doing his best to stay out of trouble. But no matter how little he spoke of that episode, something had changed forever. There was a silent pact in the air, an agreement never written, yet still alive, almost like a code of honor. The first time he realized he wasn't alone was on a moonless night, when two armed men appeared near. His property. They weren't from town, and they didn't look like they were there for friendly conversation. The cowboy was ready to draw his gun when out of nowhere he heard a distant sound, a long whistle, repeated 3 times. Within seconds, shadows emerged between the trees, moving fast and silently. The two intruders backed away, scanning the darkness nervously, before disappearing into the night. The cowboy saw no faces, but he knew it wasn't a coincidence. Over time, situations like that repeated themselves. Once at the market, a stranger tried to start a fight over a petty misunderstanding. Before the trouble could escalate, a tall man with striking features and a steady gaze stepped between them, placed a hand on the aggressor's shoulder, and said something in the language of the tribe. The man turned pale and walked away without looking back. The cowboy simply nodded in silence, recognizing the gesture without needing an explanation. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because this kind of protection didn't come only from an old favor. It was the direct result of a shared mindset, the understanding that certain acts create bonds stronger than any contract. Behind these appearances was an invisible system at work. It wasn't constant surveillance, but a silent network that showed up only when real danger was near. He had never asked for help. In fact, he didn't even know how or when they decided to act. But it was as if, in moments of risk, someone far away knew exactly where he was and what was happening. It made him rethink many things about loyalty, reciprocity, and the impact of seemingly small choices. Saving the young native years ago had been a decision made in just a few seconds, in the heat of urgency. Yet its reach had extended far beyond anything he could have imagined. One incident made this even clearer. During a trip to a neighboring town, the cowboy was confronted by a group of men who wanted to take his horse. The tension rose quickly, but before any violence began, an arrow struck the ground just inches from one of the aggressors. The silence that followed was heavy, and within a second, they all backed off. He never saw where it came from, but he felt the gesture carried the same invisible signature that had followed him for years. It was strange to live like that, knowing there was a force around him, ready to act, but without a face, without a voice, without demands. At the same time, it was comforting. He understood this wasn't just gratitude, but a way to keep alive the memory of an act of courage and compassion that, to others, might have seemed insignificant. That silent protection shaped the way he saw the world. He realized that true influence isn't in loud alliances or written agreements, but in what's built with integrity and sustained over time. It was a constant reminder that some decisions turn into legacies, even if no one else knows about them. The cowboy no longer counted the years. Since that day, he found the young native hidden in the brush, with the look of someone carrying the weight of the world. Time had passed, but the memory remained alive, not just as a recollection, but as a quiet marker that had altered the course of his life. He didn't speak about it in barroom conversations or let it slip in campfire stories. It was a guarded chapter, one that didn't need applause to have value. But deep down, he knew that moment had redefined his very identity. In the solitude of the mornings, when the sun cut across the horizon and painted the sky red, he reflected on how certain decisions are like stones cast into water. At the instant they touch the surface, they seem small, but the ripples they create spread far beyond what the eye can see. By saving the leader's son, he hadn't just helped one man, He had built a bridge between worlds that for decades had looked at each other with suspicion. Now I want to go even deeper into this, because at the heart of this story is not just the act of courage itself, but what it represents. Courage in its essence is not the absence of fear, it's acting in spite of it. And when that action is guided by a sense of justice or genuine compassion, it has the power to create connections that transcend cultures, languages, and borders. It's as if there's a hidden truth that few people notice. Sometimes, a single choice has enough impact to transform not only the life of the one who receives, but also of the one who gives. The cowboy understood that true alliances aren't born from political agreements or calculated favors. They arise from moments when you put something of yourself on the line without knowing what will come in return. It's a risk that, at first, seems reckless, but over time reveals its worth. He had lived to see that in moments of danger, there were watchful eyes and ready hands willing to act in his favor, even though he had never called for them. These experiences also changed the way he looked at the past. Those old mistakes which once weighed on him like chains began to feel different, not because they were forgotten, but because, in a way, they had been redefined. Life had shown him that an act of integrity can balance the inner scale of someone carrying regrets. It doesn't erase what was done, but it gives new meaning to what's yet to come. Every time he crossed paths with a member of the tribe, there was a silent acknowledgement, a slight nod, a steady look, a gesture that, to an inattentive observer, might go unnoticed. But for him it was proof that the bridge still stood. And perhaps that was the most powerful thing, knowing that, even without words, there was a link tying him to an entire people, built not from convenience but from trust. Over time, the cowboy realized he didn't need grand speeches to explain this journey. It was enough to live according to what he had learned, that courage and loyalty are rare seeds, but when planted in the right soil, they grow deep roots strong enough to withstand any storm. And in the silence of the desert, he understood that this was the most valuable legacy he could carry. If you've made it this far, it's because this story spoke to you in some way. And that's why I want to invite you to continue this journey with me. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next stories. Each one brings lessons, emotions, and reflections that, like this one, can leave a special mark. Also, leave your comment below with the phrase, "I'm with you till the end." It's our way of knowing you walked with me until the very last second, and that this message resonated with you. And if this connection we've built here touched you, leave your like. It helps keep this exchange alive and makes it possible for more people to find stories like this. There's another story right here that's going to move you. Click and keep going with me over there.